All right, guys, welcome to section 12. It's going to be a short one, I promise. This one is all about kind of leaving prison and avoiding prison in the first place. So here's our funny internet picture of the section. Aww, isn't he so cute? Kitties are so cute. I'm more of a dog person, but dang it, cats are cute. All right? So, what are the different ways? Let's say you're convicted, okay? You're not going to get a fine. You're not going to, get off with it scot-free. What are kind of the options, okay? Well, the first two on this list are kind of alternatives to prison, okay? The first is diversion. Now, diversion is anything that kind of means a non-prison sentence. It could be alcohol and drug rehab. It could be community service. It could be some kind of, non-incarceration or non-prison system run kind of a thing. And diversion is becoming increasingly more and more popular, especially for first-time offenders, because we want to make sure that we don't prisonize someone that doesn't really need it, right? So these diversion programs are designed to be A, cheaper for the taxpayer, and B, try to make sure that the person is less likely to reoffend compared to what would happen if they went to prison. Another option other than prison is probation. Okay, a lot of people view probation and parole as kind of two meanings for the same thing. They're not. They are fundamentally different. Probation is an alternative to prison. So if you're on probation, that means you didn't go to prison. Parole is after prison. Okay? But probation, each state does probation a little bit differently. In the state of Texas, which is where I'm from, probation, essentially, if you get sentenced to some certain number of years. Okay, so you get sentenced to 5 years. But the judge can give you the option of doing it on probation rather than prison, right? So you can serve your 5 years on probation rather than having to serve your 5 years in prison. But here comes the tricky part. Let's say you do 4 years of your 5-year probation sentence and then you screw up. And the judge is like, nope, you messed up your probation, you're going to prison. How long do you go to prison for? Not 1 year. You do have to do the full 5 years. No matter how much of your probation you finished, if you did 4 years, 4 out of 5 or 9 out of 10 or whatever, you have to start all over with your prison sentence. Different states do it in different ways. For all I know, Texas could have changed since I moved away, but that was the way it was done way back in the day. But probation is essentially supervision by a probation officer to make sure you're going to work and make sure you're not getting into trouble and making sure you're not doing all those bad things outside of prison. Okay, and there's parole. These next four are all ways to get out of prison. So this is leaving prison. The first two are avoiding prison. These last four are leaving prison. A very, very common way to get out of prison is on parole. And essentially what happens here is you've served some significant chunk of your sentence, and a parole board gets together and says, he's been a decent prisoner. We don't think he's going to recidivate. He's one of the fairly decent ones. We're going to let him out early. And then there's going to be a parole officer that follows up with him, very similar to a probation officer. Make sure you have a job and you're not getting into drugs or alcohol, and kind of keeps an eye on you while you're on parole until the ultimate sentence is finished. Okay, so let's say I went to prison. I got sentenced to 10 years. I was in prison for 7. I would have to be on parole for the next 3. Okay. Next on the list is what's called a good time release. Not all jurisdictions do this, but in some jurisdictions you can earn what's called good time. Meaning if you are a good prisoner, you work a prison job, you don't get in trouble, you don't commit violence, you don't get caught with contraband, all those things, you earn more than 1 day for every day you serve towards your sentence, right? So let's say I can earn 1.5 days for every day I don't get in trouble, right? Then if I get sentenced to 3 years, but I can earn 1.5, I can earn half a day of good time for every day I serve and don't get in trouble. I could get a good time release after only 2. And then I'm done. It's not a matter of parole, it's a matter of a good time release. My time served plus my good time earned equals my total sentence. It means I'm done. I'm out. I'm not on parole. Like I'm just done. Then there's a mandatory release, which basically means I serve my entire sentence. So I got sentenced to 10 years, I serve 10 years, right? Then I'm done. I don't go on parole. I don't, none of that. I'm just done. They let me out. I'm a free man. Okay? This is usually, if you're not a fairly horrible inmate, you're probably going to get out on parole or good time release, depending on the jurisdiction. So these mandatory releases are relatively rare. And then the last and most rare of all these is the pardon. Okay? For federal crimes, the president has the power to pardon anybody he or she wants. Okay? A lot of times this brings down some political fallout, so they don't use it super often, but they are able to pardon or commute a sentence. Again, a lot of times people will kind of confuse pardons and commutations. They're different. A pardon basically means it wipes the slate clean. Like you are pardoned, there is nothing you have to do anymore, you're done. A commutation just basically means I'm going to let you out of prison early, right? So you've served 15 years of a 25-year sentence. The parole board is not giving you parole for some reason. I think you're deserving of getting out of prison early, so I'm going to commute your sentence, okay? So slight difference, but there is a difference. And in the federal government, the president has the power to do pardons and commutations. In the states, each state does it differently. In a lot of states, it's the governor, right? So the governor has the power to pardon or commute. In some states, like in Georgia, the power to pardon or commute rests in the Bureau of the Parole Board, basically. The people who grant parole are also the people who grant pardons. But those are very rare. A president might give out, 20 or 30 of them in 4 years, sometimes even less. So those are very rare, but if you can get them, they're basically, especially at the federal system, there's very little that anybody can do to stop a president from pardoning anybody they want to. There is no oversight of the presidential pardoning process. Gerald Ford, who took over after Nixon resigned, one of Gerald Ford's first actions as president was to pardon Richard Nixon. That was very, very controversial, but essentially that meant that Nixon could not be charged with any federal crime based on the whole Watergate scandal that caused him to resign. And notice in that case, Ford had pardoned Nixon before he was even charged with a crime, right? It was right after he resigned, Ford just preemptively pardoned him for any crimes he may have committed. Barack Obama commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning had served, I can't remember exact numbers, it was something like 10 years of a 25-year sentence. And Barack Obama, one of his last acts as president was to say, you know what, Chelsea Manning has served enough time, she can get out of prison now. That wasn't a pardon, that was a commutation. So she still was a felon, she still served 10 years officially or whatever it was, but she's out of prison now. And then Donald Trump, one of his first acts, one of his early acts as president was to pardon Joe Arpaio, who was convicted of civil rights violations by a federal court. And that caused a lot of kind of hubbub and political fallout for Donald Trump. So it is used relatively rarely. Not a lot of people can say they got out of prison because of a pardon or a commutation from the president or the governor or whoever holds the that power in your state. Probation started in 1841. This guy named John Augustus comes along, and there was a guy who was essentially accused of like a drunken disorderly charge, right? And he was obviously an alcoholic, although they didn't use that term back in 1841. So this guy named John Augustus comes along and talks to the judge and say, hey, judge, how about instead of sending him to prison, you give me a few weeks or a few months with this guy. Let me see if I can turn him around. Judge says, all right, give it a shot. So John Augustus goes and basically works to reform this guy, make him no longer an alcoholic, works to make sure that he can get along in society. And it works. So John Augustus starts doing it more and more and more and more and more, asks for other volunteers, and they're not getting paid a dime, right? They're not probation officers in the modern sense. They were just kind of volunteers who would go to judges and say, look, this particular person, I think I can reform them, give me a chance, and if I can't, you can send them to prison, but if I can, you know, hopefully this will fix the problem. And these early ones were mostly kind of vice crimes, you know, alcohol, drug, prostitution, kind of, you know, that kind of vice stuff. And these volunteers were mostly came from churches and other religious groups, and they were attempting to just kind of fix the problems that were underneath the crimes. But anyway, in the 21st century, probation has become a very big thing. Okay, 56% of all convictions result in probation as at least part of the sentence. Okay, and remember, probation is an alternative to prison. So instead of going to prison, 56% of people who are convicted of crimes get probation rather than prison. 65% of that 56% will successfully complete that probation. Okay, so they don't get their probation revoked at any point. So that's roughly 2/3 will successfully complete their probation. They'll do all the things their probation officer asked them to for the entire time that they have been given probation. If the probation officer wants to revoke their probation, they are entitled to a revocation hearing. So the probation officer doesn't have the power to just say, nope, you screwed up, you're going to prison. They are retired to a hearing in front of a judge where the probationer has their chance to kind of state their case and say, this is why I shouldn't go to prison. And the probation officer can present their case, this is how they screwed up, and then the judge gets to decide whether that probation is actually revoked or continues. The vast majority of kind of the problems with probation, the revocations, are due to drugs and alcohol. Okay, there are conditions of probation, right? So when you're on probation, there are certain conditions that you have to follow. There's general conditions and there's specific conditions. The general conditions are the ones that basically everybody gets, okay? And one of those is no drugs or alcohol. If you're on probation, you're not allowed to drink, you're not allowed to do any drugs. Sorry, sucks for you. Doesn't matter what your crime was that you're on probation for. Could be something that has absolutely nothing to do with drugs or alcohol. Doesn't matter. You still are required by conditions of your probation to abstain from drugs and alcohol. So that is one of the most common, if not the most common, reason for revocation, is that the probation officer caught them drinking or doing drugs or whatever. There are other general conditions of probation. Usually you have to either find or maintain a job. You're not allowed to get in trouble with the law. You have to live in a certain place that the probation officer knows and approves of, things like that. But then there are also specific conditions of probation, which are unique to the individual. Maybe not unique, but the judge, you know, whenever the judge gives somebody probation, they say, here are the general conditions, which is for everybody, but then specifically for you, I'm also going to give you this, 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 and this, right? So maybe it's if you got arrested with your friend Billy Bob, one of your specific conditions of probation might be you're not allowed to associate with Billy Bob, right? You're not allowed to be his friend anymore. You can't meet up with him, you can't call him, you can't hang out with him. One of them might be you have to stay away from such and such area of the city. Those are the ones that are just specific to the individual crime that was committed, and they're kind of at the power of the judge to decide. Now, a probation officer is essentially a law enforcement officer. In most areas of the country, they don't carry a gun, but in a few areas of the country, they have started carrying guns because they are attacked a lot by their probationers. But what's really interesting about probation officers is they have a lot more power when it comes to their probationers than police officers do with normal members of the public. So for instance, if you are on probation, you have voluntarily given up your Fourth Amendment rights, and that probation officer is allowed to search whatever of yours they want whenever they want. They do not need your consent. They don't even need to inform you. They can search your house, they can search your car, they can search your backpack or any other possessions you have whenever they want, for no reason. They don't need a warrant, because as part of that probation agreement, you have agreed to give up your Fourth Amendment rights when it comes to your probation officer. They can also delegate that authority in some jurisdictions to police officers. So a lot of times if a police officer pulls you over and they're kind of suspicious and they ask to search your car and you say no, police officer will ask, are you on probation or parole? And if you say yes, they will call up your probation or parole officer and be like, hey, can I search this guy's car? And if they say yes, doesn't matter that you said no to the police officer, you have given up that right as part of your probation or parole agreement. Okay? Now, again, similar to probation is parole, but probation is an alternative to prison. Parole is after prison. Parole is you getting out early. Okay? So we've let out people on parole. 22% will commit some new crime. 6% will abscond, which means they'll run away, they'll leave the jurisdiction. And 52% will be successful. Okay? They will successfully complete their parole and no longer be under the auspices of the government, the federal government or the state government. Okay? So it's the majority of the time parole is successful, but not always. Decisions are given to usually a state parole board. Okay, this parole board could be made up of a few people, could be made up of a whole bunch of people. Every time somebody comes up for parole, they kind of read their file. What crime were they convicted of? What do the victims say about this offender? How have they acted in prison? Do they have any write-ups? Have they gotten in trouble for this or that? Are they violent? Are they a member of a gang? All these things. And then sometimes, usually they'll interview the person, say, hey, why do you think you should get parole? Do you think you'd reoffend? What was your problem? What made you offend the first time? And then based on all that information and how long, what percentage of their sentence that they've served, the parole board will either decide to grant parole or reject parole. Sometimes these parole boards are part of the Department of Corrections, right? So like the State Department of Corrections will have, as part of its group, a parole board. Or sometimes they're independent. They're completely not connected to the Department of Corrections in any way, other than they obviously, work with prisoners. But they're independent. They're not employees of the Department of Corrections, and that independence is seen as allowing them the ability to kind of make their own decisions and not to be influenced by outside forces, if you will. You can't get parole unless you have served 1/3 of your sentence, right? So if you get sentenced to 30 years, you're eligible for parole. Even theoretically, you are theoretically eligible for parole after 10 years. In reality, if you get a 30-year sentence, you probably won't get parole after 10. The people who get parole very early in their sentences tend to have shorter sentences. Those the people who get sentenced to 3 years might be out in 1 or 1.5, but you're not theoretically eligible for parole until 1/3 of your sentence is up. Now, if you get life, So in many states, there's life without the possibility of parole, which means you're not eligible for parole at all, ever. But if you just get sentenced to life, you're usually eligible for parole after, say, 20 or 25 years. Depends on the state. It also depends. So there's consecutive sentences and there's concurrent sentences. Okay, so if you are found guilty of more than one count or more than one charge, you are going to get a different sentence for each one. Okay, so let's say I'm convicted of 3 counts of assault. Each count, I am punished with 1 year in prison. If I serve them consecutively, that means I serve one after the other, meaning 1 year sentence, then a 1 year sentence, then a 1 year sentence, so my total sentence is 3 years. The judge also has the ability to tell me I am serving my sentences concurrently, meaning I'm serving them all at the same time, which means that if I have 3 1-year sentences, my total sentence is only 1 year. Okay? So when you get sentenced, the judge will say whether you're serving consecutive sentences or whether you're serving concurrent sentences, and that affects how long until you've finished with 1/3 of your sentence, right? This parole is designed to be a tool, one tool, with which states can reduce their overcrowding problems. Okay, because prisons all over the country, especially in states like Texas and California, are holding way more prisoners than they were designed to hold, right? So they might be designed for 5,000 people, but they currently have 10,000 in them, meaning that causes all kinds of logistical and Eighth Amendment issues, all right? So a lot of these states, they're kind of either their state court system or their federal court system is coming down and saying, look, you have to reduce overcrowding. And one of the tools they use to do that is parole. So they'll kind of lower their standards for parole and say, like, okay, well, if we weren't overcrowded, we would want you to stay in prison, but because we're overcrowded, we need to get rid of people. You're a non-violent offender. You've served half of your sentence or whatever. We'll let you out on parole. So it's one tool they can use to reduce that overcrowding problem. The conditions of parole are usually very, very similar to the conditions on probation, right? There's the general requirements and the specific requirements. The general requirements usually entail, no drugs or alcohol, maintain a job, report in once a week or once every 2 weeks or whatever. But then there's also specific conditions, which might be, stay away from this group or stay away from that geographic area or whatever. But they're very similar to the conditions for probation. So recidivism. Recidivism is one of those really interesting concepts that's hard to define, right? So if I get convicted of a crime and I serve a sentence and then I get out, is it recidivism if I get rearrested? Is it recidivism if I get reconvicted? Or is it only recidivism if I get put back into prison, right? So it's hard to define. It's also can be difficult to track because a lot of the people who get out of prison just kind of are gone and we don't know what happens to them. They might have been reconvicted or rearrested, but under a different name or in a different jurisdiction or somewhere. So it can be difficult to track. It can be difficult to measure. But criminal justice researchers have done a lot of research about this. There was a big study in the mid-90s, which was the peak of the crime in the United States. Crime peaked. Remember, I talked about it in an early section. Both violent crime, all crime, it peaked in right around this area, the mid-90s, and it's been going down ever since. So these numbers might be slightly lower today, but this was a very large, very good study on recidivism, and it showed that within 5 years, okay, so it tracked people who were let out of prison between 1994 and 1998, and then it tracked them for 5 years. Within 5 years, roughly 2/3 got arrested again, but less than half got reconvicted, and only about a quarter actually got sent back to prison. So the recidivism rate kind of depends on which of those three you're defining as being recidivistic. Which of those three does it take to be considered having recidivated? And then very, very interestingly, the crimes with the least recidivism are not the ones you would think. Okay, the absolute lowest rate of recidivism is for murderers. Murderers, right? That's kind of a weird thing to think. You would think that murderers are kind of the worst of the worst. They'd be the most likely to head back to prison. And then the second most lowest recidivism rates, according to many studies, not all studies, but many studies, is sex crimes. Which, the media always portrays sex criminals to be people who are incurable and, they're always going to commit sex crimes, and if you let them out, they're just going to commit it again. And there are sex criminals like that, but the vast majority, obviously, based on this data, aren't. Okay? Now, there's a lot of reasons why those two things might have lower recidivism rates. Number one, those two groups tend to spend more time in prison. And as I talked about in one of the earlier sections, we know the age crime curve. As you get older, your odds of committing crime go way, 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 way down. And if you're getting out of prison after a murder or a sex offense incarceration, you are likely to be way further along on that age crime curve than somebody who just got out of prison for assault or robbery or burglary or whatever. So just based on the fact that you are older, that might lower the recidivism rate. It also might be because those crimes are underreported, especially sex offenses. Sex offenses are incredibly underreported. So that might cause that group particular to have a lower recorded recidivism rate, whereas they might have an actual, in the real world, higher recidivism rate. We're just having a problem of measurement. But anyway, that is the end of section 12. Thank you so much for watching.